The Man by Bram Stoker, narrated by Gary Williams. Foreglimpse. I would rather be an angel than a god. The voice of the speaker sounded clearly through the hawthorn tree. The young man and the young girl who sat together on the low tombstone looked at each other. They had heard the voices of the two children talking, but had not noticed what they said. It was the sentiment, not the sound, which roused their attention. The girl put her finger to her lips to impress silence, and the man nodded. They sat as still as mice, whilst the two children went on talking. The scene would have gladdened a painter's heart. An old churchyard, the church low and square-towered, with long, mullioned windows. The yellow-grey stone, roughened by age and tender-hued, with lichens. Round it clustered many tombstones, tilted in all directions. Behind the church, a line of gnarled and twisted yews. The churchyard was full of fine trees. On one side, a magnificent cedar, on the other, a great copper beech. Here and there, among the tombs of the headstones, many beautiful, blossoming trees rose from the long green grass. The laburnum glowed in the June afternoon sunlight. The lilac, the hawthorn, and the clustering meadowsweet, which fringed the edge of the lazy stream, mingled their heavy sweetness in sleepy fragrance. The yellow-grey crumbling walls were green in places, with wrinkled harts' tongues, and were topped with sweet williams, and spreading houseleek and stone-crop and wild flowers, whose delicious sweetness made for the drowsy repose of perfect summer. But amid all that mass of glowing colour, the two young figures seated on the grey old tomb stood out conspicuously. The man was in the conventional hunting dress, red coat, white stock, black hat, white breeches, and top boots. The girl was one of the richest, most glowing, and yet, withal daintiest figures the eye of man could linger on. She was in riding habit of hunting scarlet cloth. Her black hat was tipped forward by piled-up masses, red golden hair. Round her neck was a white lawn scarf in the fashion of a man's hunting stock, close-fitting and sinking into a golden-buttoned waistcoat of snowy twill. As she sat, with the long skirt across her left arm, her tiny black top boots appeared underneath. Her gauntleted gloves were of white buckskin. Her riding whip was plaited of white leather, topped with ivory and banded with gold. Even in her 14th year, Miss Stephen Norman gave promise of striking beauty of a rarely composite character. In her, the various elements of her race seemed to have cropped out. The firm, set jaw, with chin broader and more square than is usual in a woman, and the wide, fine forehead and aquiline nose marked the high descent from Saxon through Norman. The glorious mass of red hair, of the true flame colour, showed the blood of another ancient ancestor of northern race, and suited well with the voluptuous curves of the fully crimson lips, the purple-black eyes, the raven eyebrows and eyelashes, and the fine curve of the nostrils spoke of the Eastern blood, of the far-back wife of Crusader. already she was tall for her age, with something of that lankiness which marks the early development of a really fine figure. Long-legged, long-necked, as straight as a lance, with head poised on the proud neck like a lily on its stem. Stephen Norman certainly gave promise of a splendid womanhood. Pride, self-reliance, and dominance were marked in every feature, in her bearing and in her lightest movement. Her companion, Harold Ann Wolfe, was some 5 years her senior, and by means of those 5 years and certain qualities, had long stood in the position of her mentor. He was more than 6'2" in height, deep-chested, broad-shouldered, lean-flanked, long-armed, and big-handed. He had that appearance strength, with well-poised neck and forward set of the head, which marks the successful athlete. The two sat quiet, listening. Through the quiet hum of afternoon came the voices of the two children. Outside the lych gate, under the shade of the spreading cedar, the horses stamped occasionally, as the flies troubled them. The grooms were mounted. One held the delicate-limbed white Arab, the other the great black horse. "I would rather be an angel than God." The little girl who made the remark was an ideal specimen of the village Sunday school child. Blue-eyed, rosy-cheeked, thick-legged, with her straight brown hair tied into a hard bunch with a much creased, cherry-coloured ribbon. A glance at the girl would have satisfied the most sceptical as to her goodness. Without being in any way smug, she was radiant with self-satisfaction and well-doing. A child of the people, an early riser, a help to her mother, a good angel to her father, a little mother to her brothers and sisters, cleanly in mind and body, self-reliant, full of faith, cheerful. The other little girl was prettier, but of a more stubborn type, more passionate, less organized, and infinitely more assertive. Black-haired, black-eyed, swarthy, large-mouthed, snub-nosed, the very type and essence of unrestrained, impulsive, emotional, sensual nature. A seeing eye would have noted inevitable danger for the early years of her womanhood. She seemed amazed by the self-abnegation implied by her companion's statement. After a pause, she replied, "I wouldn't. I'd rather be up at the top of everything and give orders to the angels if I chose." "I can't think, Marjorie, why you'd rather take orders than give them." "That's just it, Susan. I don't want to give orders. I'd rather obey them. It must be very terrible to think of things so much that you want everything done your own way. And besides, I shouldn't like to have to be just." "Why not?" The voice was truculent, though there was wistfulness in it also. "Oh, Susan, just fancy having to punish. For, of course, justice needs punishing as well as praising. Now an angel has such a nice time helping people and comforting them, and bringing sunshine into dark places, putting down fresh dew every morning, making the flowers grow, and bringing babies and taking care of them till their mothers find them. Of course, God is very good and very sweet and very merciful, but Oh, he must be very terrible. All the same, I would rather be God and able to do things. Then the children moved off, out of earshot. The two seated on the tombstone looked after them. The first to speak was the girl, who said, "That's very sweet and good of Marjorie, but do you know, Harold, I like Susie's idea better." "Which idea was that, Stephen?" "Why, didn't you notice what she said? I'd like to be God and be able to do things." "Yes," he said, after a moment's reflection. "That's a fine idea in the abstract, but I doubt of its happiness in the long run." "Doubt of its happiness? Come now, what could there be better after all? Isn't it good enough to be God? What more do you want?" The girl's tone was quizzical, but her great black eyes blazed with some thought of sincerity, which lay behind the fun. The young man shook his head with a smile of kindly tolerance as he answered, "It isn't that. Surely you must know it. I'm ambitious enough, goodness knows, but there are bounds to satisfy even me. But I'm not sure that the good little thing isn't right." She seemed somehow to hit a bigger truth than she knew. Fancy having to be just. I don't see much difficulty in that. Anyone can be just. "Pardon me," he answered. "There is perhaps nothing so difficult in the whole range of a man's work." There was distinct defiance in the girl's eyes as she asked, "A man's work? Why, a man's work? Isn't it a woman's work also?" "Well, I suppose it ought to be. Theoretically. Practically, it isn't." "And why not, pray?" The mere suggestion of any disability of a woman as such aroused immediate antagonism. Her companion suppressed a smile as he answered deliberately, "Because, my dear Stephen, the Almighty has ordained that justice is not a virtue women can practice. Mind, I do not say women are unjust. Far from it. Where there are no interests of those dear to them, they can be of a sincerity, of justice that can make a man's blood run cold. But justice in the abstract is not an ordinary virtue. It has to be considerate as well as stern, and above all, interest of all kinds and of everyone." The girl interrupted hotly. "I don't agree with you at all. You can't give an instance where women are unjust. I don't mean, of course, individual instances, but classes of cases where justice is habitual." The suppressed smile cropped out now unconsciously around the man's lips in a way which was intensely aggravating to the girl. "I'll give you a few," he said. "Did you ever know a mother just to a boy who beat her own boy at school?" The girl replied quietly, "Ill-treatment and bullying are subjects for punishment, not justice." "Oh, I don't mean that kind of beating. I mean getting the prizes their own boys contended for, getting above them in class, showing superior powers in running or cricket or swimming, or in a way of the forms of effort in which boys vie with each other." The girl reflected. Then she spoke. "Well, you may be right. I don't altogether admit it, but I accept it as not on my side. But this is only one case, a pretty common one. Do you think That sheriff of Galloway, who, in default of a hangman, hanged his son with his own hands, would have done so if he had been a woman? The girl answered at once. Frankly, no. I don't suppose the mother was ever born who would do such a thing. But that is not a common case, is it? Have you any other? The young man paused before he spoke. There is another, but I don't think I can go into it fairly with you. Why not? Well, because after all, you know, Stephen, you are only a girl, and you can't be expected to know. The girl laughed. Well, if it's anything about women, surely a girl, even of my tender age, must know something more of it, or be able to guess at, than any young man can. However, say what you think, and I'll tell you frankly if I agree. That is, if a woman can be just in such a matter. Shortly, the point is this. Can a woman be just to another woman, or to a man, for the matter of that, where either her own affection or a fault of the other is concerned? I don't see any reason to be contrary. Surely pride alone should ensure justice in the former case, and the consciousness of superiority in the other. The young man shook his head. Pride and the consciousness of superiority? Are they not much the same thing? But whether or no, if either of them has to be relied on, I'm afraid the scales of justice would want regulating, and her sword should be blunted in the case. Its edge should be turned back on herself. I have an idea that although pride might be a guiding principle with you individually, it would be a failure with the average. However, as it would be in any case a rule subject to many exceptions, I must let it go. Harold looked at his watch and rose. Stephen followed him, transferring her whip into the hand which held up her skirt. She took his arm with her right hand, in the pretty way in which a young girl clings to her elders. Together they went out the lynch gate. The groom drew over with the horses. Stephen patted hers and gave her a lump of sugar. Then, putting her foot into Harold's ready hand, she sprang lightly into the saddle. Harold swung himself into the saddle with the dexterity of an accomplished rider. As the two rode up the road, keeping on the shady side under the trees, Stephen said quietly, half to herself, as if the sentence had impressed itself on her mind, "To be God, and able to do things." Harold rode on in silence. The chill of some vague fear was upon him. Chapter 1. Stephen. Stephen Norman of Normanstand had remained a bachelor until close on middle age, when the fact took hold of him that there was no immediate heir to his great estate, whereupon, with his wonted decision, he set about looking for a wife. He had been a close friend of his next neighbour, Squire Rowley, ever since their college days. They had, of course, been often in each other's houses, and Rowley's young sister, almost a generation younger than himself, and the sole fruit of his father's second marriage, had been like a little sister to him too. She had, in the 20 years which had elapsed, grown to be a sweet and beautiful young woman. In all the past years, with the constant opportunity which friendship gave of close companionship, the feeling never altered. Squire Norman would have been surprised had he been asked to describe Margaret Rowley, and found himself compelled to present the pictures of a woman, not a child. Now, however, when his thoughts went womanward and westward, he awoke to the fact that Margaret came within the category of those he sought. His usual decision ran its course. Semi-brotherly feeling gave place to a stronger and perhaps more selfish feeling. Before he even knew it, he was head over ears in love with his pretty neighbour. Norman was a fine man, stalwart and handsome. His 40 years sat so lightly on him that his age never seemed to come into question in a woman's mind. Margaret had always liked him and trusted him. He was the big brother who had no duty in the way of scolding to do. His presence had always been a gladness, and the sex of the girl, first unconsciously, then consciously, answered to the man's overtures, and her consent was soon obtained. When in the fullness of time it was known that an heir was expected, Squire Norman took for granted that the child would be a boy, and held the idea so tenaciously that his wife, who loved him deeply, gave up warning and remonstrance after she had once tried to caution him against too fond a hope. She saw how bitterly he would be disappointed in case it should prove to be a girl. He was, however, so fixed on the point that she determined to say no more. After all, it might be a boy. The chances were equal. The squire would not listen to anyone else at all, so as the time went on, his idea was more firmly fixed than ever. His arrangements were made on the base that he would have a son. The name was of course decided. Stephen had been the name of all the squires of Normanstand for ages, as far back as the records went. And Stephen, the new heir, of course, would be, like all middle-aged men with young wives, he was supremely anxious as the time drew near. In his anxiety for his wife, his belief in the son became passive rather than active. Indeed, the idea of a son was so deeply fixed in his mind that it was not disturbed even by his anxiety for the young wife he idolized. When instead of a son, a daughter was born, the doctor and the nurse, who knew his views on the subject, held back from the mother for a little the knowledge of the sex. Dame Norman was so weak that the doctor feared lest anxiety as to how her husband would bear the disappointment might militate against her. Therefore the doctor sought the squire in his study and went resolutely at his task. "Well, squire, I congratulate you on the birth of your child." Norman was of course struck with the use of the word child, but the cause of his anxiety was manifested by his first question. "How is she, doctor? Is she safe?" The child was, after all, of a secondary importance. The doctor breathed more freely. The question had lightened his task. There was, therefore, more assurance in his voice as he answered. "She is safely through the worst of her trouble, but I'm greatly anxious yet. She is very weak. I fear anything that might upset her." The squire's voice came quick and strong. "There must be no upset. And now tell me about my son." He spoke the last word, half with pride, half bashfully. "Your son is a daughter." There was silence for so long that the doctor began to be anxious. Squire Norman sat quite still, his right hand, resting on the writing table before him, became clenched so hard that the knuckles locked, white and the veins red. After a long, slow breath, he spoke. "She, my daughter, is well?" The doctor answered with cheerful alacrity. "Splendid! I never saw a fine child in my life. She will be comfort and an honour to you." The squire spoke again. "What does her mother think? I suppose she's very proud of her. She does not know yet that it is a girl. I thought it better not to let her know till I had told you." "Why?" Because Norman, old friend, you know why. Because you had set your heart on a son, and I know how it would grieve that sweet young wife and mother to feel disappointed. I want your lips to be the first to tell her, so that one may assure her of your happiness in that a daughter has been born to you." The squire put out his great hand and laid it on the other's shoulder. There was almost a break in his voice as he said, "Thank you, my old friend, my true friend, for your thought. When may I see her? By right, not yet, but as knowing your views, she may fret herself till she knows. I think you'd better come at once." All Norman's love and strength combined for his task. As he leant over and kissed his young wife, there was real fervour in his voice as he said, "Where is my dear daughter, that you may place her in my arms?" For an instant there came a chill to the mother's heart, and her hopes had been so far disappointed. But then came the reaction of her joy, and her husband, her baby's father, was pleased. There was a heavenly dawn of red on her pale face as she drew her husband's head down and kissed him. "Oh, my dear," she said, "I'm so happy that you are pleased." The nurse took the mother's hand gently and held it to the baby as she laid it in the father's arms. He held the mother's hand as he kissed the baby's brow. The doctor touched him gently on the arm and beckoned him away. He went with careful footsteps, looking behind as he went. After dinner, he talked with the doctor on various matters, but presently he asked, "I suppose, doctor, it is no sort of rule that the first child regulates the sex of a family?" "No, of course not. Otherwise, how should we see boys and girls mixed in one family, as is nearly always the case? But, my friend," he went on, "you must not build hopes so far away. I have to tell you that your wife is far from strong. Even now she is not so well as I could wish, and there yet may be change." The squire leaped impetuously to his feet as he spoke quietly. "Then why are we waiting here? Can nothing be done? Let us have the best help, the best advice in the world." The doctor raised his hand. Nothing can be done as yet. I have only fear. Then let us be ready in case your fears should be justified. Who are the best men in London to help in such a case? The doctor mentioned 2 names, and within a few minutes a mounted messenger was galloping to Norster, the nearest telegraph centre. The message was to arrange for a special train if necessary. Shortly afterwards, the doctor went again to see his patient. After a long absence, he came back, pale and agitated. Norman felt his heart sink. When he saw him, a groan broke from him as the doctor spoke. "She is much worse. I'm in a great fear that she may pass away before the morning." The squire's strong voice was clouded with a hoarse veil as he asked, "May I see her?" "Not yet. At present she is sleeping. She may wake, strengthened, in which case you can see her. But if not—" The voice was not like his own. "Then I shall send for you at once." The doctor returned to his vigil. The squire, left alone, sank on his knees, his face in his hands. His great shoulders shook with the intensity of his grief. An hour or more passes before he heard hurried steps. He sprang to the door. "Well?" "You had better come now." "Is she better?" "Alas, no. I fear her minutes are numbered. School yourself, my dear old friend. God will help you in this bitter hour. All you can do now is to make her last moments happy." I know," he answered in a voice so calm that his companion wondered. When they came into the room, Margaret was dozing. When her eyes opened, and she found her husband beside her bed, there spread over her face a glad look which, alas, soon changed to one of pain. She mentioned to him to bend down. He knelt and put his head beside her on the pillow. His arms went tenderly round her, as though by his iron devotion and strength he would shield her from all harm. Her voice came very low, and in broken gasps. She was summoning all her strength that she might speak. "My dear husband, I'm so sad at leaving you. You have made me so happy, and I love you so. Forgive me, dear, for the pain I know you will suffer when I'm gone. And, oh, Stephen, I know you will cherish our little one, yours and mine, when I'm gone. She will have no mother. You will have to be father, and mother too. I will hold her in my very heart core, my darling, as I hold you." He could hardly speak from emotion. She went on. "And oh, my dear, you will not grieve that she is not a son to carry on your name?" And then a sudden light came into her eyes, and there was exultation in her weak voice as she said, "She is to be our only one. Let her be indeed our son. Call her the name we both love." For answer, he rose and laid his hand very, very tenderly on the babe as he said, "This dear one, my sweet wife, who will carry your soul in her breast, will be my son, the only son I shall ever have. all my life long. I shall, please Almighty God, so love her, our little Stephen, as you and I love each other." She laid her hand on his, so that it touched at once her husband and her child. Then she raised the other weak arm and placed it round his neck, and their lips met. Her soul went out in the last kiss. Chapter 2. The Heart of a Child. For some weeks after his wife's death, Squire Norman was overwhelmed with grief. He made a brave effort, however, to go through the routine of his life, and succeeded so far that he preserved an external appearance of bearing his loss with resignation. But within, all was desolation. Little Stephen had winning ways which sent deep roots into her father's heart. The little bundle of nerves which the father took into his arms must have realized in all its senses that in all that it saw and heard and touched, there was nothing but love and help and protection. Gradually, the trust was followed by expectation. If by some chance the father was late in coming to the nursery, the child would grow impatient and cast persistent, longing glances at the door. When he came, all was joy. Time went quickly by, and Norman was only recalled to its passing by the growth of his child. Seed time and harvest, the many comings of nature's growth, were such commonplaces to him, and had been for so many years, that they made on him no impressions of comparison. But his baby was one and one only. Any change in it was not only in itself a new experience, but brought into juxtaposition what is with what was. The changes that began to mark the divergence of sex were positive shocks to him, for they were unexpected. In the very dawn of babyhood, dress had no special import to his masculine eyes. Sex was lost in youth. But little by little came the tiny changes which convention has established. And with each change came the Squire Norman, the growing realization that his child was a woman, a tiny woman, it is true, and requiring more care and protection and devotion than a bigger one, but still a woman. The pretty little ways, the eager caresses, the grasping and holding of the childish hands, the little roguish smiles and pantings and flirtings were all but repetitions in little of the dalliance of long ago. The father, after all, reads in the same book in which the lover found his knowledge. At first there was, through all his love for his child, a certain resentment of her sex. His old hope of a son had been rooted too deeply to give way easily. But when the conviction came, and with it the habit of its acknowledgment, there came also a certain resignation, which is the halting place for satisfaction. But he never, not then nor afterwards, quite lost the old belief that Stephen was indeed a son. Could there ever have been a doubt? The remembrance of his wife's eyes, of her faint voice, of her hope and her faith, as she placed her baby in his arms, would have refused it a resting place. This belief tinged all his afterlife and moulded his policy with regard to his girl's upbringing. If she was to be indeed his son, as well as his daughter, she must from the first be accustomed to boyish as well as to girlish ways. This, in that she was an only child, was not a difficult matter to accomplish. Had she had brothers and sisters, matters of her sex would soon have found their own level. There was one person who objected strongly to any deviation from the conventional rule of a girl's education. This was Miss Letitia Rowley, who took after a time, in so far as such a place could be taken, that of the child's mother. Letitia Rowley was a young aunt of Squire Rowley of Norwood, the younger sister of his father and some 16 years his own senior. When the old squire's second wife had died, Letitia, then a conceited spinster of 36, had taken possession of the young Margaret. When Margaret had married Squire Norman, Miss Rowley was well satisfied, for she had known Stephen Norman all her life. Though she could have wished a younger bridegroom for her darling, she knew it would be hard to get a better man, or one of more suitable station in life. Also, she knew that Margaret loved him, and the woman who had never found the happiness of mutual love in her own life found a pleasure in the romance of true love, even when the wooer was middle-aged. She had been travelling in the Far East when the belated news of Margaret's death came to her. When she had arrived home, she announced her intention of taking care of Margaret's child, just as she had taken care of Margaret. For several reasons, this could not be done in the same way. She was not old enough to go and live at Normanstand without exciting comment, and the squire absolutely refused to allow that his daughter should live anywhere except in his own house. Educational supervision, exercised at such distance and so intermittently, could neither be complete nor exact. Though Stephen was a sweet child, she was a wilful one, and very early in life manifested a dominant nature. This was a secret pleasure to her father, who, never losing sight of his old idea that she was both son and daughter, took pleasure as well as pride out of each manifestation of her imperial will. The keen instinct of childhood, which reasons in feminine fashion, and is therefore doubtly effective in a woman-child, early grasped the possibilities of her own will. She learned the measure of her nurse's foot, and then of her father's, and so on, knowing where lay the bounds of possibility of the achievement of her wishes. She at once avoided trouble and learned how to make the most of the space within the limit of her tether. It is not those who cry for the moon who go furthest or get most in this limited world of ours. Stephen's pretty ways and unfailing good temper were a perpetual joy to her father, and when he found that, as a rule, her desires were reasonable, his wish to yield to them became a habit. Miss Rowley seldom saw any individual thing to disapprove of. She it was who selected the governesses, and who interviewed them from time to time as to the child's progress. Not often was there any complaint, for the little thing had such a pretty way of showing affection, and such a manifest sense of justified trust in all whom she encountered, that it would have been hard to name a specific fault. But though all went in tears of affectionate regret and with eminently satisfactory emoluments and references, there came an irregular timed succession of governesses. Stephen's affection for her auntie was never affected by any of the changes. Others might come and go, but there no change came. The child's little hand would steal into one of the old lady's strong ones, or would clasp a finger and hold it tight. And then the woman who had never had a child of her own would feel afresh each time, as though the child's hand was gripping her heart. With her father she was sweetest of all, and as he seemed to be pleased when she did anything like a little boy, the habit of being like one insensibly grew on her. An only child has certain educational difficulties. The true learning is not that which we are taught, but that which we take in for ourselves from experience and observation. And children's experiences and observation, especially of things other than repressive, are mainly of children. The little ones teach each other. Brothers and sisters are more with each other than are ordinary playmates, and in the familiarity of their constant intercourse, some of the great lessons, so useful in afterlife, are learned. Little Stephen had no means of learning the wisdom of give and take. To her everything was given bountifully and gracefully. Graceful acceptance of good things came to her naturally, as it does to one who is born to be a great lady. The children of the farmers in the neighbourhood, with whom at times she played, were in such habitual awe of the great house that they were seldom sufficiently at ease to play naturally. Children cannot be on equal terms on special occasions with a person whom they have been taught to bow and curtsy as a public habit. The children of neighbouring landowners, who were few and far between, and the professional people in Norchester were at such times as Stephen met them generally so much on their good behaviour that the spontaneity of play, through which it is that sharp corners of individuality are knocked off or worn down, did not exist. And so Stephen learned to read in the Book of Life, though only on one side of it. At the age of 6, she had, though surrounded with loving care and instructed by skilled teachers, learned only the accepting side of life. Giving, of course, there was in plenty, for the traditions of Normanstand were royally benevolent. Many a blessing followed the little maid's footsteps as she accompanied some timely aid to the sick and needy sent from the squire's house. Moreover, her aunt tried to inculcate certain maxims in its true sense, the giving that which we want for ourselves, the giving that is as a temple built on the rock of self-sacrifice. She knew nothing. Her sweet and spontaneous nature, which gave its love and sympathy so readily, was almost a bar to education. It blinded the eyes that would have otherwise seen any defect that wanted altering, any evil trait that needed suppression, any lagging virtue that required encouragement or the spur. Chapter 3. Harold. Squire Norman had a clerical friend whose rectory of Carstone lay some 30 miles from Normanstand. 30 miles is not a great distance for railway travel, but it is a long drive. The days had not come, nor were they ever likely to come, for the making of a railway between the two places. For a good many years the two men had met in renewal of their old university days. Squire Norman and Dr. Anne Wolfe had been chums at Trinity, Cambridge, and the boyish friendship had ripened and lasted. When Harold Anne Wolfe had put in his novitiate in a teeming Midland manufacturing town, it was Norman's influence which obtained the relationship for his friend. It was not often that they could meet, for Anne Wolfe's work, which, though not very exacting, had been done single-handed, kept him to his post. Besides, he was a good scholar, and eked out a small income by preparing a few pupils for public school. An occasional mid-week visit to Normanstand in the slack time of school work on the doctor's part, and now and again a drive by Norman over to the rectory, returning the next day, had been, for a good many years, the measure of their meeting. Then Anne Wolfe's marriage and the birth of a son had kept him closer to home. Mrs. Anne Wolfe had been killed in a railway accident a couple of years after her only child had been born, and at the time Norman had gone over to render any assistance in his power to the afflicted man, and to give him what was, under the circumstances, his best gift, sympathy. After an interval of a few years, the squire's courtship and marriage, at which his old friend had assisted, had confined his activities to a narrow circle. The last time they had met was when Anne Wolfe had come over to Norster to aid in the burial of his friend's wife. In the process of years, however, the shadow over Norman's life had begun to soften. When the baby had grown to be something of a companion, they met again. Norman, who had never since his wife's death been able to tear himself even for a night away from Normanstand and Stephen, wrote to his old friend asking him to come to him. Anne Wolfe gladly promised, and for a week of growing expectation the squire looked forward to their meeting. Each found the other somewhat changed in all but their old affection. Anne Wolfe was delighted with the little Stephen. Her dainty beauty seemed to charm him, and the child, seeming to realize what pleasure she was giving, exercised all her little winning ways. The rector, who knew more of children than did his friend, told her, as she sat on his knee, of a very interesting person, his own son. The child listened, interested at first, then enraptured. She asked all kinds of questions, and the father's eyes brightened as he gladly answered the pretty sympathetic child, already deep in his heart for her father's sake. He told her about the boy who was so big and strong, and who could run and leap and swim and play cricket and football better than any other boy with whom he played, when, warmed himself by the keen interest of a little girl, and seeing her beautiful black eyes beginning to glow, he too woke to the glory of the time, and all the treasured moments of the father's lonely heart gave out their store, and the other father thrilled with delight because of his baby's joy, with underlying all and added pleasure that the little Stephen's interest was in sports that were for boys, looked on approvingly, now and again asking questions himself in furtherance of the child's wishes. All the afternoon they sat in the garden close to the stream that came out of the rock, and Anne Wolfe told father's tales of his only son, of the great cricket match with Castrafiorum when he had made 100 not out, of the school races when he had won many prizes, of the swimming match in the Islam River, when after he had won the race and had dressed himself, he went into the water in his clothes to help some children who had upset a boat. How, when Widow Norton's only son could not be found, he dived into the deep hole of the intake of the Millidom of the great Carstone mills, where Wingate, the farrier, had been drowned, and how after diving twice without success, he had insisted on going down the third time, though people had tried to hold him back, and how he had brought up in his arms the child all white and so near death that they had to put him in the ashes of the baker's oven before he could be brought back to life. When her nurse came to take her to bed, she slid down from her father's knee, and coming over to Dr. Anne Wolfe, gravely held out her hand and said, "Goodbye." Then she kissed him and said, "Thank you so much, Mr. Harold's daddy. Won't you come soon again and tell us more?" Then she jumped again upon her father's knee and hugged him round the neck and kissed him and whispered in his ear, "Daddy, please make Mr. Harold's daddy, when he comes again, bring Harold with him." After all, it is natural for women to put the essence of their letter in the postscript. 2 weeks afterwards, Dr. Anne Wolfe came again and brought Harold with him. The time had gone heavily with little Stephen when she knew that Harold was coming with his father. Stephen had been all afire to see the big boy whose feats had so much interested her, and for a whole week had flooded Mrs. Jarrold with questions which she was unable to answer. At last the time came, and she went out to the hall door with her father to welcome the guests. At the top of the great granite steps, down which in time of bad weather the white awning ran, she stood holding her father's hand and waving a welcome. "Good morning, Harold. Good morning, Mr. Harold's daddy." The meeting was a great pleasure to both the children and resulted in an immediate friendship. The small girl at once conceived a great admiration for the big, strong boy, nearly twice her age and more than twice her size. At her time of life, the conveniences are not, and love is a thing to be spoken out at once and in the open. Mrs. Jarrold, from the moment she set eyes on him, liked the big kindly-faced boy who treated her like a lady, and who stood awkwardly blushing and silent in the middle of the nursery, listening to the tiny child's proffers of affection. For whatever kind of love it is that boys are capable of, Harold had fallen into it. Calf love is a thing habitually treated with contempt. It may be ridiculous, but all the same, it is a serious reality to the calf. Harold's new-found affection was as deep as his nature. An only child who had in his memory nothing of a mother's love. His naturally affectionate nature had, in his childish days, found no means of expression. A man-child can hardly pour out his full heart to a man, even a father or a comrade, and this child had not, in a way, the consultations of other children. His father's secondary occupation of teaching brought other boys to the house and necessitated a domestic routine which had to be exact. There was no place for little girls in a boys' school, and though many of Dr. Ann Wolfe's friends who were mothers made much of the pretty, quiet boy and took him to play with their children, he never seemed to get really intimate with them. The equality of companionship was wanting. Boys he knew, and with them he could hold his own and yet be on affectionate terms. But girls were strange to him, and in their presence he was shy. With the lack of understanding of the other sex grew up a sort of awe of it. His opportunities of this kind of study were so few that the view never could become rectified. And so it was that from his boyhood up to his 20th year, Harold's knowledge of girlhood never increased, nor did his awe diminish. When his father had told him all about his visit to Normanstand and of the invitation which had been extended to him, there came first awe, then doubt, then expectation. Between Harold and his father there was love and trust and sympathy. The father's married love, so soon cut short, found expression towards his child, and between them there had never been even the shadow of a cloud. When his father told him how pretty the little Stephen was, how dainty, how sweet, he began to picture her in his mind's eye, and to be bashfully excited over meeting her. His first glimpse of Stephen was, he felt, one that he never could forget. She had made up her mind that she would let Harold see what she could do. Harold could fly kites and swim and play cricket. She could not do any of these, but she could ride. Harold should see her pony and see her riding him, all by herself, and there would be another pony for Harold, a big, big one. She had spoken about its size herself to Topham, the stud groom. She had coaxed her daddy into promising that, after lunch, she should take Harold riding. To this end, she had made ready early. She had insisted on putting on the Red Riding habit which Daddy had given her for her birthday, and now she stood on the top of the steps, all glorious in hunting pink, with the habit held over her arms, with the tiny hunting hoots all shiny underneath. She had no hat on, and her beautiful hair of golden red shone in its glory, but even it was almost outshone by the joyous flush on her cheeks as she stood waving the little hand that did not hold Daddy's. She was certainly a picture to dream of. Her father's eyes lost nothing of her dainty beauty. He was so proud of her that he almost forgot to wish that she had been a boy. The pleasure he felt in her appearance was increased by the fact that her dress was his own idea. During luncheon, Stephen was fairly silent. She usually chattered all through, as freely as a bird sings. Stephen was silent because the occasion was important. Besides, Daddy wasn't all alone, and therefore had not to be cheered up. Also, this in postscript form, Harold was silent. In her present frame of mind, Harold could do no wrong, and what Harold did was right. She was unconsciously learning already a lesson from his presence. That evening, when going to bed, she came to say good night to Daddy. After she had kissed him, she also kissed old Mr. Harold, as she now called him, and, as a matter of course, kissed Harold also. He coloured up at once. It was the first time a girl had ever kissed him. The next day, from early morning until bedtime, was one long joy to Stephen, and there were few things of interest that Harold had not been shown. There were few of the little secrets which had not been shared with him as they went about hand in hand. Like all manly boys, Harold was good to little children and patient with them. He was content to follow Stephen about and obey all her behests. He had fallen in love with her to the very bottom of his boyish heart. When the guests were going, Stephen stood with her father on the steps to see them off. When the carriage had swept behind the farthest point in the long avenue, and when Harold's cap, waving from the window, could no longer be seen, Squire Norman turned to go in, but paused in obedience to the unconscious restraint of Stephen's hand. He waited patiently till, with a long sigh, she turned to him and they went in together. That night, before she went to bed, Stephen came and sat on her father's knee, and after sundry pattings and kissings, whispered in his ear, "Daddy, wouldn't it be nice if Harold could come here all together? Couldn't you ask him to? And old Mr. Harold could come too. Oh, I wish he was here." Chapter 4. Harold at Normanstand. 2 years afterwards, a great blow fell upon Harold. His father, who had been suffering from repeated attacks of influenza, was, when in the low condition following this, seized with pneumonia, to which in a few days he succumbed. Harold was heartbroken. The affection which had been between him and his father had been so consistent that he had never known a time when it was not. When Squire Norman had returned to the house with him after the funeral, he sat in silence, holding the boy's hand, till he had wept his heart out. By this time the two were old friends, and the boy was not afraid or too shy to break down before him. There was sufficient of the love of the old generation to begin with trust in the new. Presently, when the storm was past and Harold had become his own man again, Norman said, "And now, Harold, I want you to listen to me. You know, my dear boy, that I'm your father's oldest friend, and right sure I am that he would approve of what I say. You must come home with me to live. I know that in his last hours the great concern of your dear father's heart would have been for the future of his boy, and I know, too, that it was a comfort to him to feel that you and I are such friends, and that the son of my dearest old friend would be as a son to me. We have been friends, you and I, a long time, Harold, and we have learned to trust and, I hope, to love one another. And you and my little Stephen are such friends already that your coming into the house will be a joy to us all. Why, long ago, when first you came, she said to me, the night you went away, Daddy, wouldn't it be nice if Harold could come here all together? And so Harold and Wolfe came back with the Squire of Normanstand, and from that day on became a member of his house, and as a son to him. Stephen's delight at his coming was of course largely qualified by her sympathy with his grief, but it would have been hard to give him more comfort than she did in her own pretty way. Putting her lips to his, she kissed him, and, holding his big hand in both of her little ones, she whispered softly, "Poor Harold, you and I should love each other, for we have both lost our mother, and now you have lost your father, but you must let my dear Daddy be yours too." At this time, Harold was between 14 and 15 years old. He was well educated, in so far as private teaching went. His father had devoted much care to him, so that he was well grounded in all the academic branches of learning. He was also, for his years, an expert in most manly exercises. He could ride anything, shoot straight, fence, run, jump, or swim with any boy more than his age and size. In Normanstand, his education was continued by the rector. The squire used often to take him with him when he went to ride, or fish, or shoot, frankly telling him that, as his daughter was as yet too young to be his companion in these matters, he would act as her locum tenens. His living in the house and his helping, as he did, in Stephen's studies, made familiarity perpetual. He was just enough her senior to command her childish obedience, and there were certain qualities in his nature which were eminently calculated to win and keep the respect of women as well as of men. He was the very incantation of sincerity, and had now and again, in certain ways, a sublime self-negotiation which at times seemed in startling contrast to a manifestly militant nature. When at school, he had often been involved in fights which were nearly always on matters of principle, and by a sort of unconscious chivalry he was generally found fighting on the weaker side. Harold's father had been very proud of his ancestry, which was Gothic through the Dutch, as the manifestly corrupted prefix of the original name implied, and he had gathered from a constant study of the sagas something of the philosophy which lay behind the ideas of the Vikings. This new stage of Harold's life made for quicker development than any which had gone before. Hitherto he had not the same sense of responsibility. To obey is in itself a relief, and as it is an actual consolation to weak natures, so it is only a retarding of the strong. Now he had another individuality to think of. There was in his own nature a vein of anxiety, of which the subconsciousness of his own strength threw up the outcrop. Little Stephen, with the instinct of her sex, discovered before long this weakness. For it is a weakness when any quality can be assailed or used. The using of a man's weakness is not always coquetry, but it is something very like it. Many a time the little girl who looked up to and admired the big boy who could compel her to anything when he was so minded would, for her own ends, work on his sense of responsibility, taking an elfine delight in his discomfiture. The result of Stephen's harmless little coquetries was that Harold had occasionally either to thwart some little plan of daring or else cover up its results. In either case, her confidence in him grew, so that before long he became an established fact in her life, a being in whose power and discretion and loyalty she had absolute blind faith, and this feeling seemed to grow with her own growth. Indeed, at one time, it came to be more than an ordinary faith. It happened thus. The old church of St. Stephen, which was the parish church of Normanstand, had a peculiar interest for the Norman family. They're either within existing walls or those which had preceded them when the church was rebuilt by that Sir Stephen, who was standard bearer to Henry VI, were buried all the direct members of the line. It was an unbroken record of the inheritors since the first Sir Stephen, who had his place in the Doomsday Book. Without, in the churchyard close to the church, were buried all such of the collaterals as had died within hall of Norster. Some there were, of course, who, having achieved distinction in various walks of life, were further honoured by a resting place within the chancel. The whole interior was full of records of the family. Squire Norman was fond of coming to the place, and often from the very beginning had taken Stephen with him. One of her earliest recollections was kneeling down with her father, who held her hand in his, whilst with the other he wiped the tears from his eyes before a tomb sculptured beautifully in snowy marble. She never forgot the words he had said to her. "You will always remember, darling, that your dear mother rests in this sacred place. When I'm gone, if you were ever in any trouble, come here, come alone, and open out your heart. You need never fear to ask God for help at the grave of your mother." The child had been impressed, as had been many and many another of her race. For 700 years, each child of the House of Norman had been brought alone by either parent and had heard some such words. The custom had come to be almost a family ritual, and it never failed to leave its impress in greater or lesser degree. Whenever Harold had in his early days paid a visit to Normanstand, the church had generally been an objective of their excursions. He was always delighted to go. His love for his own ancestry made him admire and respect that of others, so that Stephen's enthusiasm in the matter was but another cord to bind him to her. In one of their excursions, they found the door into the crypt open, and nothing would do, Stephen, but that they should enter it. Today, however, they had no light, but they arranged that on the morrow they would bring candles with them and explore the place thoroughly. The afternoon of the next day saw them at the door of the crypt with a candle, which Harold proceeded to light. Stephen looked on admiringly and said in a half-conscious way, the half-consciousness being shown in the implication, "You are not afraid of the crypt?" "Not a bit. In my father's church there was a crypt, and I was in it several times." As he spoke, the memory of the last time he had been there swept over him. He seemed to see again the many lights held in hands that were never still, making a grim gloom where the black shadows were not. To hear again the stamp and hurried shuffle of the many feet as the great oak coffin was borne by the struggling mass of men down the steep stairway and in through the narrow door, and then the hush when voices faded away and the silence seemed a real thing. As for a while he stood alone, close to the dead father, who had been all in all to him, and once again he seemed to feel the recall to the living world of sorrow and of light when his inert hand was taken in the strong loving one of Squire Norman. He paused and drew back. "Why don't you go on?" she asked, surprised. He did not like to tell her then. Somehow it seemed out of place. He had often spoken to her of his father, and she had always been a sympathetic listener. But here, at the entrance of the grim vault, he did not wish to pain her with his own thoughts of sorrow, and all the terrible memories which the similarity of the place evoked. And even whilst he hesitated, there came to him a thought so laden with pain and fear that he rejoiced at the pause which gave it to him in time. It was in that very crypt that Stephen's mother had been buried, and had they two gone in, as they had intended, the girl might have seen her mother's coffin as he had seen his father's, but under circumstances which made him shiver, he had been, as he said, often in the crypt at Carstone, and well he knew the sordidness of the chamber of death. His imagination was alive as well as his memory. He shuddered, not for himself, but for Stephen. How could he allow the girl to suffer in such a way, as she might, as she inevitably would, if it were made apparent to her in such a brutal way? How pitiful, how meanly pitiful is the aftermath of death. Well, he remembered how many a night he woke in an agony, thinking of how his father lay in that cold, silent, dust-strewn vault, in the silence and the dark, with never a ray of light or hope or love, gone, abandoned, forgotten by all, save perhaps one heart which bled. He would save little Stephen, if he could, from such a memory. He would not give any reason for refusing to go in. He blew out the candle and turned the key in the lock, took it out and put it in his pocket. "Why not?" The lips that spoke were pouted mutinously, and the face was flushed. The imperious little lady was not at all satisfied to give up the cherished project. For a whole day and night she had, whilst waking, thought of the coming adventure. The thrill of it was not now to be turned to cold disappointment without even an explanation. She did not think that Harold was afraid. That would be ridiculous. But she wondered, and mysteries always annoyed her. She did not like to be at fault, more especially when other people knew. All the pride in her revolted. "Why not?" she repeated more imperiously still. Harold said kindly, "Because, Stephen, there is really a good reason. Don't ask me, for I can't tell you. You must take it from me that I'm right. You know, dear, that I wouldn't willingly disappoint you, and I know that you had set your heart on this. But indeed, I have a good reason." Stephen was really angry now. She was amenable to reason, though she did not consciously know what reason was. But to accept someone else's reason blindfold was repugnant to her nature, even at her then age. She was about to speak angrily, but looking up, she saw that Harold's mouth was set with marble firmness. So, after her manner, she acquiesced in the inevitable and said, "All right, Harold." But in the inner recesses of her firm-set mind was a distinct intention to visit the vault when more favourable circumstances would permit. Chapter 5. The Crypt. It was some weeks before Stephen got the chance she wanted. She knew it would be difficult to evade Harold's observation, for the big boy's acuteness as to facts had impressed itself on her. It was strange that out of her very trust in Harold came a form of distrust in others. In the little matter of evading him, she inclined to anyone in whom there was his opposite, in whose reliability she instinctively mistrusted. There is nothing bad or good, but thinking makes it so. To enter that crypt, which had seemed so small a matter at first, had now, in process of thinking and wishing and scheming, become a thing to be much desired. Harold saw, or rather felt, that something was in the girl's mind, and took for granted that it had something to do with the crypt. But he thought it better not to say anything, lest he should keep awake a desire which he hoped would die naturally. One day it was arranged that Harold should go over to Carstone to see the solicitor who had wound up his father's business. He was to stay the night and ride back next day. Stephen, on hearing of the arrangement, so contrived matters that Master Everard, the son of a banker who had recently purchased an estate in the neighbourhood, was asked to come to play with her on the day when Harold left. It was holiday time at Eton, and he was at home. Stephen did not mention to Harold the fact of his coming. It was only from a chance allusion of Mrs. Jarrold before he went that he inferred it. He did not think the matter of sufficient importance to wonder why Stephen, who generally told him everything, had not mentioned this. During their play, Stephen, after pledging him the secrecy, told Leonard of her intention of visiting the crypt and asking him to help her in it. This was an adventure, and as such commended itself to the schoolboy heart. He entered at once into the scheme con amour, and the two discussed ways and means. Leonard's only regret was that he was associated with a little girl in such a project. It was something of a blow to his personal vanity, which was a large item in his moral equipment, that such a project should have been initiated by the girl and not by himself. He was to get possession of the key, and in the forenoon of the next day he was to be waiting in the churchyard when Stephen would join him as soon as she could evade her nurse. She was now more than 11 and had less need of being watched than in her earlier years. It was possible with strategy to get away undiscovered for an hour. At Carstone, Harold got through what he had to do that same afternoon and arranged to start early in the morning for Normanstand. After an early breakfast, he set out on his 30-mile journey at 8 o'clock. Little John, his horse, was in excellent form, notwithstanding his long journey of the day before, and, with his nose pointed for home, put his best foot foremost. Harold felt in great spirits. The long ride the day before had braced him physically, though there were on his journey times of great sadness when the thought of his father came back to him, and the sense of loss was renewed with each thought of his old home. But youth is naturally buoyant. His visit to the church, the first thing on his arrival at Carstone, and his kneeling before the stone made sacred to his father's memory, though it entailed a silent gush of tears, did him good, and even seemed to place his sorrow farther away. When he came again in the morning, before leaving Carstone, there were no tears. There was only a holy memory, which seemed to sanctify loss, and his father seemed nearer to him than ever. As he drew near Normanstand, he looked forward eagerly to seeing Stephen, and the sight of the old church lying far below him as he came down the steep road over Alt Hill, which was the shortcut from Norster, set his mind working. His visit to the tomb of his own father made him think of the day when he kept Stephen from entering the crypt. The keenest thought is not always conscious. It was without definite intention that when he came to the bridle path, Harold turned his horse's head and rode down to the churchyard. As he pushed open the door of the church, he half expected to see Stephen, and there was a vague possibility that Leonard Everard might be with her. The church was cool and dim. Coming from the hot glare, the August sunshine, it seemed, at the first glance, dark. He looked around, and a sense of relief came over him. The place was empty. But even as he stood there, came a sound which made his heart grow cold, a cry muffled, far away, and full of anguish, a sobbing cry which suddenly ceased. It was the voice of Stephen. He instinctively knew where it came from, the crypt. Only for the experience he had had of her desire to enter the place, he would never have suspected that it was so close to him. He ran towards the corner where commenced the steps leading downward. As he reached the spot, a figure came rushing up the steps. A boy in Eton jacket and wide collar, careless, pale, and agitated. It was Leonard Everard. Harold seized him as he came. "Where is Stephen?" he cried, in a quick, low voice. "In the vault below there. She dropped her light, and then took mine, and she dropped it too. Let me go, let me go." He struggled to get away, but Harold held him tight. "Where are the matches?" "In my pocket." "Let me go, let me go." "Give me them, this instant." He was examining the frightened boy's waistcoat pockets as he spoke. When he had got the matches, he let the boy go and ran down the steps and through the open door into the crypt, calling out as he came, "Stephen! Stephen, dear! Where are you? It is I, Harold." There was no response. His heart seemed to grow cold and his knees to weaken. The match spluttered and flashed, and in the momentary glare he saw across the vault, which was not a large place, a white mass on the ground. He had to go carefully lest the match should be blown out by the wind of his passage, but on coming close he saw that it was Stephen, lying senseless in front of the great coffin, which rested on a built-out pile of masonry. Then the match went out. In the flare of the next one he lit, he saw a piece of candle lying on top of the coffin. He seized and lit it. He was able to think coolly despite his agitation, and knew that light was the first necessity. The bruised wick was slow to catch. He had to light another match, his last one, before it flamed. The couple of seconds that the light went down, till the grease melted and the flame leaped again, seemed of a considerable length. When the lit candle was placed steadily on top of the coffin, and a light, dim though strong enough to see, with spread around, he stopped and lifted Stephen in his arms. She was quite senseless, and so limp that a great fear came upon him that she might be dead. He did not waste time, but carried her across the vault, where the door to the church steps stood, out sharp and against the darkness, and bore her up into the church, holding her in one arm. With the other hand he dragged some long cushions from one of the pews, and spread them on the floor. On these he laid her. His heart was smitten with love and pity as he looked. She was so helpless, so pitifully helpless. Her arms and legs were doubled up as though broken, disjointed. The white frock was smeared with patches of thick dust. Instinctively he stooped and pulled the frock down and straightened out the arms and feet. He knelt beside her and felt if her heart was still beating. A great fear over him, a sick apprehension, a gush of thankful prayer came from his heart. Thank God, she was alive. He could feel her heart beat, though faintly, underneath his hand. He started to his feet and ran towards the door, seizing his hat, which lay on the seat. He wanted it to bring back some water. As he passed out of the door, he saw Leonard a little distance off, but took no notice of him. He ran to the stream, filled his hat with water, and brought it back. When he came into the church, He saw Stephen, already partially restored, sitting up on the cushions, with Leonard supporting her. He was rejoiced but somehow disappointed. He would rather Leonard had not been there. He remembered, he could not forget, the white face of the boy who fled out of the crypt, leaving Stephen in a faint within, and who had lingered outside the church door whilst he ran for water. Harold came forward quickly and raised Stephen, intending to bring her into the fresh air. He had a shrewd idea that the sight of the sky and God's greenery would be the best medicine for her after her fright. He lifted her in his strong arms as he used to do when she was a very little child and had got tired in their walks together, and carried her to the door. She lent herself unconsciously to the movement, holding fast with her arm around his neck, as she used to do. In her clinging was the expression of her trust in him. The little sigh with which she laid her head on his shoulder was the tribute to his masculine power and her belief in it. Every instant her senses were coming back to her more and more. The veil of oblivion was passing from her half-closed eyes, as the tide of full remembrance swept in upon her. Her inner nature was expressed in the sequence of her emotions. Her first feeling was one of her own fault. The sight of Harold and his proximity recalled to her vividly how he had refused to go into the crypt, and how she had intentionally deceived him negatively as to her intention of doing that of which he disapproved. Her second feeling was one of justice, and was perhaps partially evoked by the sight of Leonard, who followed close as Harold brought her to the door. She did not wish to speak of herself or Harold before him, but she did not hesitate to speak of him to Harold. "You must not blame Leonard. It was all my fault. I made him come." Her generosity appealed to Harold. He was angry with the boy for being there at all, but more for his desertion of the girl in her trouble. "I'm not blaming him for being with you," he said simply. Leonard spoke at once. He had been waiting to defend himself, for that was what first concerned that young gentleman. Next to his pleasure, his safety most appealed to him. "I went to get help. You had let the candle drop, and how could I see in the dark? You would insist on looking at the plate on the coffin." A low moan broke from Stephen, a long, low, trembling moan, which went to Harold's heart. Her head drooped over again on his shoulder, and she clung close to him as the memory of her shock came back to her. Harold spoke to Leonard over his shoulder in a low, fierce whisper, which Stephen did not seem to hear. "There, that will do. Go away. You have done enough already. Go, go," he added, more sternly, as the boy seemed disposed to argue. Leonard ran a few steps, then walked to the lich gate where he waited. Stephen clung close to Harold in a state of agitation which was almost hysterical. She buried her face in his shoulder, sobbing brokenly. "Oh, Harold, it was too awful. I never thought, never for a moment, that my poor dear mother was buried in the crypt. And when I went to look at the name on the coffin, that was nearest to where I was. I knocked away the dust, and then I saw her name, Margaret Norman, Iatat 22. I couldn't bear it. She was only a girl herself, only just twice my age, lying there in that terrible dark place, with all the thick dust and the spiders' webs. Oh, Harold, Harold, how shall I ever bear to think of her lying there, and that I shall never see her dear face? Never, never. He tried to soothe her by patting and holding her hands. For a good while the resolution of the girl faltered, and she was but as a little child. Then her habitual strength of mind asserted itself. She did not ask Harold how she came to be out in the church, instead of in the crypt when she recovered her senses. She seemed to take it for granted that Leonard had carried her out, and when she said how brave it had been for him, Harold, with his customary generosity, allowed her to perceive the belief. When they had made their way to the gate, Leonard came up to them, but before he could speak, Stephen had begun to thank him. He allowed her to do so, though the sight of Harold's mouth set in scorn and his commanding eyes firmly fixed on him made him grow hot and cold alternately. He withdrew without speaking and took his way home with a heart full of bitterness and revengeful feelings. In the dark, Stephen tried to dust herself, and then Harold tried to assist her, but her white dress was incurably soiled. The fine dust of the vault seemed to have got ingrained in the muslin. When she got to the house, she stole upstairs, so that no one might notice her till she had made herself tidy. The next day but one, she took Harold for a walk in the afternoon. When they were quite alone and out of earshot, she said, "I have been thinking all night about poor mother. Of course I know she cannot be moved from the crypt. She must remain there, but there needn't be all that dust. I want you to come there with me sometime soon. I fear I'm afraid to go alone. I want to bring some flowers to tidy up the place. Won't you come with me this time? I know now, Harold, why you didn't let me go in before. But now it is different. This is not curiosity. It is duty and love. Won't you come with me, Harold?" Harold leaped from the edge of the ha-ha where he had been sitting, and held up his hand. She took it and leaped down lightly beside him. "Come," he said, "let us go there now." She took his arm when they got on the path again, and clinging to him in her pretty girlish way, they went together to the piece of garden which she called her own. There they picked a great bunch of beautiful white flowers. Then they walked to the old church. The door was open, and they passed in. Harold took from his pocket a tiny key. This surprised her, and heightened the agitation which she naturally suffered from revisiting the place. She said nothing whilst he opened the door to the crypt. Within, on a bracket, stood some candles in glass shades and boxes of matches. Harold lit 3 candles, and leaving one of them on the shelf, and placing his cap beside it, took the other 2 in his hands. Stephen, holding her flowers tightly to her breast with her right hand, took Harold's arm with the left, and, with beating heart, entered the crypt. For several minutes Harold kept her engaged, telling her about the crypts in his father's church, and how he went down at his last visit to see the coffin of his dear father, and how he knelt before it. Stephen was much moved, and held tight to his arm, her heart beating. But in the time she was getting accustomed to the place, her eyes, useless at first on coming out of the bright sunlight and not able to distinguish anything, began to take in the shape of the place and to see the rows of great coffins that stood out along the far wall. She also saw with surprise that the newest coffin, on which for several reasons her eyes rested, was no longer dusty, but was scrupulously clean. Following with her eyes as well as she could see into the further corners, she saw that there the same reform had been effected. Even the walls and the ceiling had been swept of the hanging cobwebs, and the floor was clean with the cleanliness of ablution. Still holding Harold's arm, she moved over towards her mother's coffin and knelt before it. Harold knelt with her. For a little while she remained still and silent, praying inwardly. Then she rose and, taking her great bunch of flowers, placed them lovingly on the lid of the coffin above, where she thought her mother's heart would be. Then she turned to Harold, her eyes flowing and her cheeks wet with tears, and laid her head against his breast. Her arms could not go round his neck till he had bent his head, for with his great height he simply towered above her. Presently she was quiet. The paroxysm of her grief had passed. She took Harold's hand in both hers, and together they went to the door, with his disengaged hand, for he would not have disturbed the other for worlds. Harold put out the lights and locked the door behind them. In the church, she held him away from her, and looked him fairly in the face. She said slowly, "Harold, was it you who had the crypt cleaned?" He answered in a low voice, "I knew you would want to go again." She took the great hand which she held between hers, and before he knew what she was doing and could prevent her, raised it to her lips and kissed it, saying lovingly, "Oh, Harold, no bother in the world could be kinder, and," this with a sob, "we both thank you, Mother and I." Chapter 6. A Visit to Oxford. The next important move in the household was Harold's going to Cambridge. His father had always intended this, and Squire Norman had borne his wishes in mind. Harold joined Trinity, the college which had been his father's, and took up his residence in due course. Stephen was now nearly 12. Her range of friendships, naturally limited by her circumstances in life, was enlarged to the full, and if she had not many close friends, there were, at least, of them all that was numerically possible. She still kept up to a certain degree the little gatherings, which in her childhood were got together for her amusement, and in the various games then instituted she still took a part. She never lost sight of the fact that her father took a certain pleasure in her bodily vigour, and though with her growing years and the conscious acceptance of her womanhood, she lost sight of the old childish fancy of being a boy instead of a girl, she could not lose sight of the fact that strength and alertness are sources of feminine as well as of masculine power. Amongst the young friends who came from time to time during his holidays was Leonard Everard, now a tall, handsome boy. He was one of those boys who developed young and who seemed never to have any of the gawky stage so noticeable in the youth of men, made in a large pattern. He was always well poised, trim-set, alert, fleet of foot, and springy all over. In games he was facile princeps, seeming to make his effort always in the right way, and without exertion, as if by a instinct of physical masterdom. His universal success in such matters helped to give him an easy, debonair manner, which was in itself winning. So physically complete a youth has always a charm. In its very presence there is a sort of a sympathetic expression, such as comes with the sunshine. Stephen always in Leonard's presence showed something of the common attitude. His youth and beauty and sex all had their influence on her, the influence of sex, as it is understood with regard to a later period of life, did not in her case exist. Cupid's darts are barbed and winged for more adult victims. But in her case, Leonard's masculine superiority, emphasized by the few years between their age, his sublime self-belief, and, above all, his absolute disregard for herself or her wishes or her feelings, put him on a level at which she had to look up to him. The first step in the ladder of preeminence had been achieved when she realized that he was not on her level. The second, when she experienced rather than thought that he had more influence on her than she had on him. Here again was a little morsel of hero worship, which, though based on a misconception of fact, was still of influence. In that episode of the crypt, she had always believed that it was Leonard who had carried her out and laid her on the church floor in light and safety. He had been strong enough and resolute enough to do this, while she had fainted. Harold's generous forbearance had really worked to a false end. It was not strange, therefore, that she found occasional companionship with the handsome, wilful, domineering boy somewhat of luxury. She did not see him often enough to get tired of him, to find out the weaknesses of his character, to realize his deep-seated, remorseless selfishness. But after all, he was only an episode in a young life, which was full of interests. Term after term came and went. The holidays had their seasonable pleasures, occasionally shared in common. That was all. Harold's attitude was the same as ever. He was of a constant nature, and now that manhood was within hail, the love of his boyhood was ripening to a man's love. That was all. He was, with regard to Stephen, the same devoted worshipping protector, without thought of self, without hope of reward. Whatever Stephen wished, Harold did, and Stephen, knowing their old wishes and their old pleasures, was content with their renewal. Each holiday between the terms became mainly a repetition of the days of the old life. They lived in the past. Among the things that did not change was Stephen's riding dress. The scarlet habit had never been a thing for everyday wear, but had from the first been kept for special occasions. Stephen herself knew that it was not a conventional costume, but she rather preferred it, if on that account alone. In a certain way she felt justified in using it, for a red habit was a sort of tradition in the family. It was on one of these occasions that she had gone with Harold into the churchyard, where they had heard the discussion regarding God and the angels. When Stephen was about 16, she went for a short visit to Oxford. She stayed at Somerville with Mrs. Egerton, an old friend of her mother's, who was a professor at the college. She sent back her maid who had travelled with her, as she knew that the college girls did not have servants of their own. The visit was prolonged by mutual consent into a duration of some weeks. Stephen fell in love with the new place and the life, and had serious thoughts of joining the college herself. Indeed, she had made up her mind to ask her father to allow her, knowing well that he would consent to that, or to any other wholesome wish of hers. But then came the thought that he would be all alone at home, and following that came another thought, and one of more poignant feeling. He was alone now. Already for many days she had left him for the first time in her life. Stephen was quick to act. Well, she knew that at home there would be no fault found with her for a speedy return. Within a few hours she had brought her visit to an end, and was by herself, despite Mrs. Egerton's protest, in the train on the way back to Norster. In the train she began to review, for the first time, her visit to the university. All had been so strange and new and delightful to her that she had never stopped for retrospect. Life in the new and enchanting place had been in the moving present. The mind had been receptive only, gathering data for later thought. During her visit, she had no one to direct her thought, and so it had been all personal, with the freedom of individuality at large. Of course, her mother's friend, skilled in the mind workings of average girls, and able to pick her way through intellectual and moral quagmires, had taken good care to point out to her certain intellectual movements and certain moral interest, architectural beauties and spots of historic import, and she had taken in, loyally accepted, and thoroughly assimilated all that she had been told. But there were other lessons, which were for her young eyes facts which the older eyes had ceased to notice, if they had ever noticed them at all. The self-content, the sex content in the endless tide of young men that thronged the streets and quads and parks, the all-sufficing nature of sport or study, to whichever their inclinations tended, the small part which womankind seemed to have in their lives. Stephen had had, as we know, a peculiar training, whatever her instincts were. Her habits were largely boy habits. Here she was among boys, a glorious tide of them. It made now and again her heart beat to look at them, and yet amongst them all she was only an outsider. She could not do anything better than any of them. Of course, each time she went out, she became conscious of admiring glances. She could not be a woman without such consciousness, but it was as a girl that men looked at her, not as an equal. As well as personal experience and the lessons of eyes and ears and intelligence, there were other things, fragments of common-room gossip, which it had been her fortune to hear accidentally now and again, the half-confidences of scandals borne on whispering breaths, the whole confidences of dormitory and study which she had been privileged to share. All were parts of the new strange world, the great world which had swum into her ken. As she sat now in the train, with some formulation of memory already accomplished in the 2 hours of solitude, her first comment, spoken half audibly, would have surprised her teachers as much as it would have surprised herself if she had been conscious of it, for as yet her thinking was not self-conscious. Surely I'm not like that. It was of the woman she had been thinking, not of the man. The glimpse which she had had of her own sex had been an awakening to her, and the awakening had not been to a pleasant world. All at once she seemed to realize that her sex had defects, littlenesses, meaningnesses, cowardices, falsenesses, that their occupations were apt to be trivial or narrow or selfish, that their desires were earthly, and their tastes coarse, that what she held to be goodness was apt to be realized only as fear, that innocence was but ignorance, or at least baffled curiosity, that a flood of shame swept over her, and instinctively she put her hands before her burning face. As usual, she was running all at once into extremes, and above all these was borne upon her, and for the first time in her life, that she was herself a woman. For a long time she sat quite still. The train thrilled and roared on its way. Crowded stations took and gave their quantum of living fright, but the young girl sat abstracted, unmoved, seemingly unconscious. All the dominance and energy of her nature were at work. If indeed she was a woman and had to abide by the exigencies of her own sex, she would at least not be ruled and limited by women's weakness. She would plan and act and manage things for herself in her own way. Whatever her thoughts might be, she could at least control her acts, and those acts should be based not on a woman's weakness, but on man's strength. Chapter 7. The Need of Knowing. When Stephen announced her intention of going with her father to the Petty Session Court, there was consternation amongst the female population of Normanstand and Norwood. Such a thing had not been heard of in the experiences of any of them. Courts of justice were places for men, and the lower courts dealt with a class of cases. It was quite impossible to imagine where any young lady could get such an idea. Miss Letitia Rowley recognized that she had a difficult task before her, for she was by now accustomed to Stephen's quiet method of having her own way. She made a careful toilet before driving over to Normanstand. Her wearing her best bonnet was a circumstance not unattended with dread for someone. Behold her then sailing into a great drawing-room at Normanstand, with her mind so firmly fixed on the task before her as to be oblivious of minor considerations. She was so fond of Stephen, and admired so truly her many beauties and fine qualities, that she was secure and without flaw in her purpose. Stephen was in danger, and though she doubted if she would be able to effect any change, she was determined that at least she should not go into danger with her eyes unopened. Stephen entered hastily and ran to her. She loved her great aunt, really and truly loved her, and indeed it would have been strange if she had not. For from the earliest hour which she could recollect, she had received from her nothing but the truest, fondest affection. Moreover, she deeply respected the old lady. Her truth, her resolution, her kindness, her genuine common-sense ability. Stephen always felt safe with her aunt. In the presence of others, she might now and again have qualm or a doubt, but not with her. There was an abiding calm in her love, answering love realized and respected. Her long and intimate knowledge of Letitia made her aware of her moods. She could read the signs of them. She knew well the meaning of the bonnet, which actually seemed to quiver as though it had a sentience of its own. She knew well the cause of her aunt's perturbation. The pain which must be caused to her was, perhaps, the point of most resistance in herself, she having made up her mind to her new experience. All she could do would be to try to reconcile her by the assurance of good intention, by reason, and by sweetness of manner. When she had kissed her and sat beside her, holding her hand after her pretty way, she, seeing the elder woman somewhat at a loss, opened the subject herself. "You look troubled, auntie. I hope it's nothing serious." "It is, my dear. Very serious. Everything is serious to me which touches you." "Me, auntie? Hypocrisy is a fine art." "Yes, yes, Stephen. Oh, my dear child, what is this I hear about your going to petty sessions with your father?" "Oh, that. Why, auntie dear, you must not let that trouble you. It is all right. That is necessary." "Necessary?" The old lady's figure grew rigid, and her voice was loud and high. "Necessary for a young lady to go to court-house, to hear low people speaking of low crimes, to listen to cases of the most shocking kind, cases of low immorality, cases of a kind of nature, of a class that you are not supposed to know anything about. Really, Stephen." She was drawing away her hand in indignation, but Stephen held it tight, as she said very sweetly, "That's just it, auntie. I'm so ignorant that I feel I should know more of the lives of those very people." Miss Letitia interrupted. "Ignorant, of course. You are ignorant. That is what you ought to be. Isn't it what we have all been devoting ourselves to effect ever since you were born? Read your 3rd chapter of Genesis, and remember what came of eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. I think the tree of knowledge must have been an orange tree." The old lady looked up, her interest aroused. "Why?" "Because ever since Eden, other brides have worn its blossom." Her tone was demure. Miss Rowley looked sharply at her, but her sharpness softened off into a smile. She said, and was silent. Stephen seized the opportunity to put her own case. "Auntie dear, you must forgive me. You really must, for my heart is set on this. I assure you, I'm not doing it merely to please myself. I have thought over the whole matter. Father has always wished me to be in a position of knowledge and experience, to manage Normanstand if I should ever succeed him. From the earliest time, I can remember he has always kept this before me, and though of course I did not at first understand what it meant, I have seemed in the last few years to know better. Accordingly, I learned all sorts of things under his care, and sometimes even without his help. I have studied the estate map, and I have been over the estate books and read some of the leases and all such matters which